Score, the podcast, the only show taking you inside the studios of the world's most celebrated composers and musical storytellers. Presented by Vienna Symphonic Library. Here are your hosts, Kenny Holmes and Matt Schrader.
What's up, everyone? I'm Kenny Holmes.
I'm Matt Schrader.
It's Matt Schrader right there, ladies and gentlemen. In the flesh, we're back. Score the podcast, another episode presented by Vienna Symphonic Library. And we have an amazing episode for you today. A little caveat. We have been touting around town that we're back in person.
Here we are.
And
look
we're
at
not
us in
doing
person.
remote interviews
no
anymore.
more. We're never doing that again.
No. But we had an opportunity and we had to take it. We have an incredible lineup for you today. We have two guests and they're joining us together.
And I've been a big fan of this director for a while, Robert Eggers.
Matt's been really excited. Robert Eggers and Robin Carolan.
Yep, the composer.
Nosferatu is out. The movie's freaking terrifying.
Yep.
We got a chance to see it in an early screening.
It's great and pretty intense.
Yeah.
So if that's not quite your cup of tea, don't see it because it's very effective. My God.
But it's great. It's very classic too. It's classic filmmaking. As a camera operator, cinematographer, I really appreciated, as always, Robert Eggers' use of lighting, shadows, a lot of old school techniques.
And I mean, I think there are some effects in there, but
there are
hidden
effects
so well.
Yeah. And there's a lot of camera tricks too. If you like editing and different, when
how'd they do that?
When you saw Birdman and you were trying to find where the cuts were, it's stuff like that where there's really long shots where you can tell maybe the camera switched.
It
from
must have somewhere
steady
in there.
cam
Somewhere
to a dolly. It's
the
did
music too. Just the opening of this, and we won't spoil anything. It is very much the classic kind of Dracula tale, and the whole background of that's interesting because Dracula was the original story by Bram Stoker in the late 1897, something like that.
Yeah.
Nosferatu was basically a knockoff of that, but then over the next few years they created each other's myth. So there were things about the kind of vampire myth that then Dracula started to take on, like you couldn't go out in the daylight. That was a thing that Nosferatu invented. So these two kind of myths that are, kind of mirrors of each other, and there's a couple differences still, but really deeply mythological story, which is something Robert Eggers does a lot of and does very well. Yeah,
with the Northman.
Northman, his first collaboration with Robin as well. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And frightening movie. You'll hear the music at the very start of it, and boy, does it just suck all of the...
I thought my heart was going to jump out of my chest in the first 2 minutes of the film, and we were in a screening with a bunch of media people, and I was like, is everyone else... okay, because I'm not a big horror film guy.
It's a lot,
and it's
in
intense.
A good way.
They absolutely knocked it out of the park with this, and I think it's a cool sign of what's to come. I feel like horror movies used to be looked at as like, oh, the goofy, campy, and in the last 10 years, horror films have really elevated to become really well-made stories. They're well reviewed.
Because it starts to feel like a drama or like a thriller,
yeah,
and this has all of that. So it's a.
If you go to old horror films on Rotten Tomatoes, it's always the popcorn meter is like 95, and the reviewers are like 19, and this is not the case. Nosferatu is amazing, and also the performances, Nicholas Hoult and Lily Rose-Depp.
It's a very well-rounded movie.
Yeah. So we're excited to talk with these guys. Stick around for that in just a bit. But before we get to that, our sponsor, as we mentioned, a new sponsor for this season, Vienna Symphonic Library. We're super excited to be partnering with these guys. Many of the films that you see and TV shows are scored at Synchron Stage in Vienna. And not only do they have their stage where these scores are being recorded, they have software packages that you can bring home and replicate the sounds. I mean, these are real instruments recorded by their orchestra, and you can use them at home. From full orchestra packages to very specific tailored stuff if you want to kind of elevate your sound and find some unique styles to use.
Yeah, this Synchron series uses all the same recording techniques and engineers and the whole team that does the real thing and creates this software suite that you can basically dial in your orchestral sound, instruments and pianos and choir, all of this stuff. And these guys came to us. They said, we're big fans of the show. This is something that a lot of composers can really use. And we've been playing around with this a little bit. And
so cool.
It's amazing what you can do. The Synchron Series is kind of the whole orchestra that you can have. Synchron strings, duality strings is what it's called. Really cool package. They've recorded things simultaneously on their big stage and on a smaller stage. It's more dry. So you can really kind of dial in the acoustics that you want, all of that kind of stuff. And then what they've done is they create this interface where you can kind of mix between the two, blend between the two to get the sound that you need for whatever it is that you're making. And you can do really cool stuff.
And it's intuitive, the user interface on these players. There's different players for each package. They're really easy to use and to experiment with. You don't have to get some sort of YouTube explainer video on how to do it. It's very kind of spelled out. You open it up and you just start clicking and pressing buttons on your keyboard. On your MIDI, you can control it
pretty
with MIDI.
Addicting.
It's pretty fun. It's pretty fun. We've been mocking up little things. Even some part of our score, you did some little additions with. And by the way, the Synchron stage, I mentioned some of the films and shows that have been recorded there. The Crown, Disney and Star Wars, Marvel movies, Bear McCreary's Rings of Power was scored there.
Mission Impossible, Dead Reckoning.
American Fiction, Laura Cartman, Ad
It's a great
Astra,
list.
Craven the Hunter, Benjamin Wallfish from our first episode this season. Volker Bertelmann did Dune Prophecy there. So many great ones and so many to come. These guys are
And
becoming...
they use the software too.
Yeah.
All of this stuff. So you want to check it out. All of the different offerings they have. Doesn't have to be expensive. We found that out. I was actually very surprised that some of this stuff you can get on your computer for, I mean, this stuff can last you years. And if you can get some of this for under a couple $100, it's an amazing deal. VSL.co.at. Go check out their free sample player that you can play around with a little bit, and some freebie libraries and some demos, and basically get your hands on this right away.
Sounds good. All right. We're going to talk to Robert Eggers and Robin Carolan. Let's get to it. All right, we are joined right now by a dynamic duo, huge movie out in Nosferatu, director Robert Eggers, composer Robin Carolan. Thank you guys so much for joining us. You're in London, yes?
We are. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we're excited to chat with you. Matt and I saw this film together in Atmos at Dolby, and it was an incredible experience. I kind of want to start with just the contrast right out of the gate with this film. We hear a music box, and it really sets the tone for what feels like we're going into this fairy tale world. And minutes later, my heart was literally ripped out of my chest by a score that was mixed super loud, and it really just set me up for, I have no idea what to expect in this, and I'm going to be freaked out. And I just wanted to know what you guys discussed in starting this film.
Well, I think Robin should speak to it musically, but just briefly, you know, when you have this kind of horror movie cold open with it that ends with a good scare, then you know you're on edge the whole time. You know, and which you kind of said, and that's we knew we needed to achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because the music box, even though it's only like a 30-second track, it was weirdly one of the harder parts of the score to figure out, mainly because Rob had like a really, really specific idea in mind about the type of sound, but also we did debate whether we should even start the film with a music box
because it's kind of a cliche of a bad horror movie, even we were definitely anxious about getting it right.
What were the things that you were trying to dial in and be really specific with how that sounded at the start?
Just, you know, how much of the mechanism we would hear, how much reverb, like how musical, how like broken, how, you know, all, you know, how diegetic, how not diegetic, you know, like, and usually like I can answer those questions, but this was definitely a case of like discovering, you know.
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah. No, we went through a lot of sounds, and I mean, we didn't really figure it out until super late in the day. I think it was literally like the last day of recording that we actually sort of figured it out. But I think again, like, you know, what Rob was saying about, because we did debate using the music box at all. It just felt like, well, this is a Gothic fairy tale, you know, and when we meet Ellen at the start of the film, she's 15. You know, when she's sleepwalking outside of the house to me even looked like a dollhouse. And, you know, it's those first few scenes in the film are ultimately about innocence being corrupted. So it just felt like, you know, we can do this. And also, I liked the idea that the score would kind of come full circle. So the very, very last scene in the film is kind of like a variation on the music box theme. And I think with those two things in place, I think it worked, you know, and hopefully doesn't sound cliched or whatnot.
And I know when we were discussing the opening of this and how it was written, there was some notation, Robert, that you put into the script that I think is very interesting to people who are fans of music, and that you framed something that has got to be very intimidating. But I wanted to ask you about that. What you scripted originally?
Well, I don't write a lot of musical descriptions in my scripts. Sometimes I do if I'm trying to like juxtapose a scene that doesn't seem on the page that scary and need to underline that it needs to have some kind of ominous underscore. But here, in trying to describe how like loud and intense the music over the title card needed to be, I think I said that, you know, it would bring Beethoven to his knees.
Which is not intimidating at all for someone like me having to read that and then think like, cool, that should be really easy. I mean, it was a great note in many respects because it really does makes it pretty clear what Rob is looking for at that point. But obviously, you know, it's quite it felt like quite a challenge, and I'm not sure if I quite achieved exactly what was on the script.
I mean, you know, Beethoven never heard aleatoric music. Maybe it would be easy to bring him to his knees with that stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, true. But
how many iterations did you go through before you brought Beethoven to his knees?
Oh, I think Robin, like, I think the first demo was pretty good.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was kind of there in theory, but I think really it all hinged on the recording, and because effectively at that moment, the entire orchestra, even though we recorded, you know, the strings and the horns, everything was like individual. Every component, every instrument that's featured on the score is featured at that point, and it basically was just about getting them to go completely mad and really like just abuse the instruments to a certain degree. So yeah, I think so much of it just hinged on that, and luckily, you know, we had the players that were able to do it, and I think it ended up I was so happy with it.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, obviously, like every score you know, evolves from the demos when it's finally recorded, because you have like live musicians who bring their interpretation and their storytelling and their humanity to it, you know, and so it's always going to be more emotional. But I think and certainly with the more melodic and thematic things, like that's, you know, how that's going to change. But I think with the aleatoric atonal stuff, you know, we were like, no, like crazier, like more demonic, and like, and you know, the vocalist, like, it's not singing, you're a banshee, you're a witch, you're a demon, like whatever, and that, you know, that really changes things. Like, it's interesting too, because like I actually had the pleasure of seeing Penderecki like conduct his own music, and it wasn't like that. It was just like, you know, but we were trying to like go full throttle.
Yeah, destroy your vocal cords.
Robert, do you go on the stage and give notes to singers and stuff like that, or is that something that you do?
Sometimes, but I mean, like Robin gives most of the notes. Like we commiserate, and then, you know, like. I have a reasonable amount of music theory that I can talk to Robin, but I wouldn't want to talk to like a highly trained musician with fumbling around with my like vocabulary that I'd be grasping for. So Robin,
but also like Rob will go out and talk to the singers, especially when, you know, because like if there are words being sung, like actual words, Rob has written them. So, you know, when it comes to those kinds of performances, Rob is going to be very particular about how they're performing, because I suppose in a way it almost becomes like a form of acting. Sure. So in those instances, Rob will kind of like run out and talk to the choir if he feels like it's not quite right. And also, you know, it's not even just about how they're performing, you know, it's like pronunciation, and that stuff's obviously very important to Rob. So yeah, there's definitely, Rob definitely gets involved when it comes to that aspect.
Robin like reminded me, because we like have it's been so long, we forgot that that the choir sings in ancient Dacian, which is a dead language. It's the language that Orlok uses with his spells, and it's the language of the ancestors of the ethnic Romanian people. And Florin Lazarescu, who's a Romanian poet and novelist and screenwriter, like did his interpretation of my poetry, and then they were singing. So, yeah, cool.
What was the origin of your guys' working relationship? I know you worked together for the first time on the Northman, and Robin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's your first, you know, real film score that you did. So what brought you guys together, and when did you know that you had kind of a creative shorthand?
Robin reached out to me when I was at Sundance with The Witch. I didn't know who he was, and he had a witchy email address and said, you know, we're into the same kind of stuff, and I think we should get a coffee. We might get along. And I thought this guy was clearly a weirdo. And then a couple weeks later, I was meeting with a friend of mine who was younger and cooler, and was like, dude, Robin Carolan runs Triangle Records. They're like the coolest label. Are you fucking out of your mind? You got to meet with this guy, you know? And so then Robin and I had coffee, and next thing you know it, we're talking about Arthurian legend, and you know, we did get along very well. So then going to a lot of Robin's shows, listening to the stuff that he worked with, he produced with other artists, talking to those artists, becoming friends with some of them, really seeing like the scope of Robin's like immense musical understanding, and also his he's also just like a really strong storyteller, like through the music that I just felt, and he also like is close to Iceland in many ways. I was like, you know, Robin needs to do the Northman.
Yeah, that. I mean, it was a surprise when Rob asked me to do the Northman. Because, I think we'd sort of talked about maybe doing something, you know, on drunken nights out, but never really sort of like gave that a shape. When Rob asked me, I had no clue that he'd been thinking about that. And, I mean, it took me about 6 weeks, I think, to sort of come back to him and agree to do it. Not because I wasn't incredibly flattered, but because I'd never even scored a short film. And I knew that the Northman was obviously going to be like a huge step up for Rob in terms of like budget and just scope everything. And having never done a score, you know, I obviously, and being that we're friends, I was quite nervous that, you know, I didn't want to be the thing that fails, you know. So I took a long time to decide to do it, because I just, was worried, but I'm glad that I did.
Yes, and as challenging as it is one of the very few New Regency films of a certain budgetary level that like kept the same composer the whole way through.
Yeah, there you go.
That's the business. Yeah.
So wait, Robin, before we move on, I just wanted to ask what was your background before this? On this show, we have a lot of people that work in the music industry who are our listeners, and specifically in film and television music. But that's not the world you came from. That was your first kind of jump into this. What were you doing before that?
My background was more in sort of like left field electronic music. So I had my own label, and I was working with a lot of artists. I had the label for about 10 years, I think. But, I was also working with people like Björk, and, it was just kind of like, very left field electronic. Occasionally would kind of dip its toes into like pop and hip hop. So when I started scoring, I was sort of approaching it from in a completely naive way, I guess, because I'm not like a conservatory trained musician. I love classical music, and I grew up having a huge passion for it, but I just don't come from that world. So that was also partly why I was a little bit apprehensive at first, because it was just completely different to everything that I'd sort of done before. But and the thing is, the Northman was like hard in that sense, because I had to learn everything. But it was sort of like the best crash course I probably could have had.
But you also, you can, the scene where Alex jumps off the boat, like, and leaves Anya, the complexity of the string arrangements and what's going on, like, melodically and harmonically with all those different layers. Like, obviously, not being conservatory trained, like, Robin's understanding of classical music, like, is large, and it's only is more clear in Nosferatu.
So you're coming from an electronic background, and then you go do the Northman, which is like the furthest from electronic music. This is a total period piece, huge orchestral moments. It must have been pretty daunting. Is that? And you did that film with Sebastian Gainsborough. Was Sebastian sort of a partner with you to train you in this film scoring world? Is that where that connection came from?
No, because Seb comes from the same background as me.
Okay.
Seb had also never done any score work like that, so we were both completely...
Seb was on the Triangle label, so Robin had produced...
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like collaborated in the past, sort of like in the electronic realm. But no, we were just both complete newbies. And part of the reason why Seb came on was because when I finally decided that I would do the Northman, I still didn't think I could do it completely by myself. So I felt like I needed someone. And, I'd always gotten on really well with Seb, and he's an amazing artist, and it just made sense. But it was daunting. It's, what I'd been doing before, and like the Northman, it was like chalk and cheese. But in a lot of ways, I was kind of up for that, because when Rob asked me to do the Northman, I was at a bit of a crossroads. I'd grown a little bit bored. I just sort of felt like I wanted to do something slightly different. And the Northman, you couldn't really get more different. So it was different, but it was a good kind of different. And also, like Rob and I are very similar in the sense that, I really love history and like researching stuff, and like when it came to the Northman, I really enjoyed researching like what's Viking music sound like, and how can we are there any like weird instruments that we can sort of find and like put into this. So it was in that sense it was great. And
it was like an interesting challenge, because also like a lot of that music is not like up our street necessarily, and there's also like what academics think Viking music is, and then which is probably more correct, and then of course there's this whole like neo-pagan like post-metal thing, like Varderna and Halong and so forth, which is also very like influential to like people who are into Viking stuff. So, and a lot of the people who knew how to play the rarefied instruments that Robin was learning about are like people in the kind of like experimental archaeology world, and also people who are into like the post-metal neo-pagan stuff. So that was like, it was an interesting whale road to sail upon.
That's a pretty good way of putting it. Yeah.
So one of the things about the Northman that really surprised me was the range of music that you have, because it goes all the way from kind of much more intimate folk sounds into this kind of supercharged, aggression. It's not an easy score in terms of keeping it cohesive, but there's so much range and there's so much music also. So I'm curious, were there points putting that together where you just thought, man, we're pushing this so far that this thing, somehow we got to keep everything together despite there being just an immense range in the score?
Yeah, it's probably every day for 18 months. Yeah, I mean, it was the Northman was not an easy project for anyone. It was, we were also doing it during the height of COVID. That project was hard. But yeah, I mean, the Northman was a tricky one because obviously it's very, it has to be very macho and it has to be very aggressive and raw, and there isn't like a huge amount of room for sensitivity. But obviously there are scenes where, I could kind of bring that to the fore, and I really enjoyed being able to do that because for the most part, the score had to kind of mirror the world that these people lived in, which is like brutal. So not, there wasn't tons of room for melody, it's a lot of drones, a lot of the instruments that we were using, like these kind of more archaic Viking instruments, they're very primitive sounding. They sound amazing, but they're very primitive. To the point where originally we weren't going to use any contemporary instruments at all. We weren't going to use like violins or cellos, but because these Viking instruments were so rough, it was just like for the more sort of like romantic moments, we just had to bring in some contemporary elements.
But it was like, how can you play like a box with some strands of horsehair like as tenderly as possible, and how can you play a violin as shittily as possible while still getting the emotion so that they merge? And also the world of the Northman is as Robin's saying, like it's very macho, it's very like stark, it's very brutal and very internal. But we did need it to be at times like more like emotional feeling than it was photographed and then it was performed, because I was trying to be really true to the Icelandic sagas, which have that kind of reserved energy, but sometimes like in order to like understand what the characters were thinking, like the music needed to be the subtext to like bring things further, because Alex was just standing there like a mountain of rage or a mountain of sadness or a mountain of whatever, but it's very internal. When except for when you're like killing people, it's very internal.
Well, it's like the scene where the berserkers are burning down the barn, the Slavic barn, and it's like that's the scene where like the music needed to be like pretty not sentimental, but it needed to be emotional, like still rough but emotional, because the thing is like the way Rob shot that, it's this close up of like Alex standing in front of, Amleth standing in front of the barn, and Amleth is unbelievably guarded as a character because that's the culture, so you had to kind of make the music somewhat emotional then, otherwise you could end up hating someone like Amleth, because otherwise it's like we can't get a read on this guy, like they're burning like old women and children behind him and he's just standing there looking sort of like slightly unhinged and sort of so it was it's a tricky film in that sense, but it's that world was rough, the music needed to kind of go with that.
Rob, going into this, I mean, we hear these stories. Danny Elfman told us Tim Burton came to him and said, "Will you score my film?" And he said, "What?" And Trent Reznor, same thing with David Fincher. As a director, going into such a monster project like The Northman, picking a composer who's never scored a film before, that's a big risk. I mean, you guys have good chemistry. You like his music style, but there's a lot more to it in terms of collaboration. I'm just wondering what made you take a risk like that, and Robin, what does it mean to you that he took that risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're harping on this a little bit too much, but to be really clear about it, like the other thing was Robin did like several demos, and the agreement was like if the demos don't work, like we're not going to do this.
Yeah,
Robin recorded like 3 pieces of music, like in London with Viking throat singers and tagliharpa players and whatever we needed, and then it was and it was like very clear to me, and it was also very clear to the studio that this was going to be awesome. I remember like like doing that sort of like one last pitch for Regency, like with all of concept art and stuff, and finished with playing the music, and they were like, we get it, we're in.
But just to say, I mean, just quickly, when Rob asked me, I thought he was crazy. I mean, I'm glad that he was, but I thought it was like an insane choice because, again, it was like a big movie, and it just seemed like such a risk because there was no sort of like certainty that I would be able to do it. Obviously, then I went on to make some demos, and that kind of helped. But yeah, I think it was insane risk, in my opinion. But I'm glad. But I'm glad that he did take that risk. I'm very grateful.
And moving to Nosferatu, once you have one film under your belt, there's probably a little better of a mindset for you, Robin, going into this film. How do you think your approach was different to start Nosferatu than it was for the Northman?
I mean, everything really. Because I mean, again, like everything. I mean, I learned everything on the Northman. So, by the time I came to do Nosferatu, I really kind of understood how these things work. And also, I think because Rob and I are friends, it's great working with your friend, but it can also, it can be risky as well, because especially when, you're involved in like projects like the ones that Rob's involved in, it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of, it's high intensity. So I think, one of the things I went into Nosferatu knowing most was that just the way you kind of like interact and how, because at times you're always going to have like moments where things are tense or you feel fucked off or sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but like, you feel fed up, and I think what you kind of just have to do, I think what kind of works for us is that, I just have to kind of go to my corner and just sort of like get on with the job and, just kind of leave a bit of space so it's not so, because otherwise things can get very like heated.
For sure.
Yeah, would you agree?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But the great thing about Nosferatu was that, like, first of all, like, there was, like, I had more control on this because, it was, it is a slightly smaller budget than the Northman, but it was also like in my wheelhouse and something that the studio understood like what it was. And so there was, and it wasn't COVID. So there's just like less tension overall with that kind of stuff. And then it was also more in me, and it was, like Robin and I liked the music in the world of Nosferatu in theory before going into it. We didn't have to like learn how to like it and learn how to make it something that we could be into. It was something that both of us like deeply love, the kind of music that is in this film, like already. I mean, it's its own thing in the end, but Gothic romanticism and horrible screeching horror stuff. It's what's better than that.
Yeah, great.
And Rob, I wanted to ask about how this, when this came together, and even before kind of the musical approach, but I'm sure music was informed by this. You had experience going back to high school, correct, with this story and putting some of this on, and then quite a while, I think, to think about it. It was rumored that you would be putting Nosferatu together, I think, a couple of years ago, or maybe even before that. So there was some time to kind of maybe marinate on some of the ideas of it. And I'm wondering how maybe that changed your approach going in, how this film might have been different 2 or 3 years ago, versus what you ended up putting together for this?
So basically, saw Nosferatu as a kid, like loved it, changed my life. Then I did a senior directed play when I was 17 with my friend Ashley Kelly Tata, who's now a theater and opera director in her own right. And it was very expressionist. It was black and white on stage, black and white makeup, wigs, sets, and kind of more in the style of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, though it was Nosferatu the story. And this dude Edward Langlois, who owned the Cool Theater in southern New Hampshire, where they did Duchess of Malfi and True S instead of My Fair Lady, he saw the play, invited us to do a more professional version at his theater, and that kind of solidified the fact that I wanted to be a director. So Nosferatu, even if I never made the film, is something that is like a very personal story for me, and it's something that's like massively part of my identity. Then, yes, about 10 years ago, I started writing the screenplay to what became this movie, and I would say it hasn't changed a whole hell of a lot since then. And in fact, while the stage play was miles away from what the film is, there are some of the tracks, because it was a silent film on stage, so there was just music the whole time. But some of the tracks that we actually used on stage were part of the the Nosferatu playlist that we put together, so I think music, I think my ability to articulate what I want on the screen and actually get my imagination to the screen improved a great deal over the 10 years, just because I got better at filmmaking, but my intentions have not changed much since I wrote the first draft of the screenplay.
And musically, there's a lot of similarities, I think, in the way that the Northman, some of the elements of the Northman come together, and this, because you're dealing with, a pretty rich mythology, even though this, the kind of vampire stories that we know are significantly younger than the Northman was. But a big part of that is this film could go a lot of different ways musically. It could be very traditional. It could be kind of your old school cinema kind of a sound. And I'm curious whether you knew going in that this needed to have this kind of higher production thing that Robin did so well, I think, in the Northman, but something that, I don't know, gives a little bit of a contrast from the more traditional thing. Because this very easily could have slipped in, I think, a musical approach that was entirely orchestra, for instance.
I mean, it kind of is for the most part, there's string quartets and there's large orchestral stuff. There is some folk instruments, and Robin can speak to that. But I think that basically, it's not Lord of the Rings or Star Wars with the themes, but there still are themes. But I think that Robin does for this kind of a film a much more interesting job of playing with the themes and doing variations on the themes so that it's felt instead of you're not hit over the head with it.
I think it's that.
That's condescending, because obviously those scores work very well for Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. They need to be like that.
I think there is a lot of quite sort of big sweeping music on the score, but yeah, there is also a lot of weird stuff. It's sort of like a it's like a score of two halves in some respects, and I think that was kind of always the plan, really, wasn't it?
Sure.
I mean, I think if it had all been big and sweeping and just sort of very orthodox sounding string sections, I think that's not really to either of our tastes.
No.
But we also like that stuff, but then we also like all the kind of aggro, experimental stuff. So Penderecki, Xenakis, Bartok, so I think the plan was to always try and fuse those things. And I think, I think kind of trying to nod a little bit to, some of the kind of Gothic melodramas of the 50s and the 60s, The Innocents, things like that, which, Rob and I both love, trying to kind of put that stuff in, but in a way that sounded sort of contemporary. I think all of that stuff was really important.
Yeah.
Orlok is shown, but not fully revealed until about halfway through the film. You did some tricks with out of focus and hands and shadows and things like that. But
Yeah.
musically, we're talking about themes. What was that approach musically to sort of lead us along the way until we finally get that moment?
I mean, obviously, it's all kind of leading up to that point at the castle where Hutter finally sees Orlok, even if it is in sort of like shadows. I mean,
sorry for interrupting, but I don't think that was that. I don't think that particular reveal of Orlok is something that we discussed musically. Was there? I mean, I'm curious. Was there something that you Was there something that you experienced musically that?
Yeah, I actually wanted to expand on that because the one big thing that I felt in the build of all of this, and Robin, I think you may have touched on this a little bit in the past, but this idea of kind of a spiral kind of a feel, and there's a repetition, there's a kind of, I mean, it's a very appropriate kind of hypnotic trance thing that starts to build, and that intensity builds to something. So we know something's coming, but I'm curious, obviously that was intentional, right? To build in some of that energy, but how did you kind of lay the track for what that needed to be to support the story?
I mean, I think, again, like you said, because we don't really see Orlok, even when we do finally see him. I mean, he's not really in a lot of the film, you know, as he wasn't in the other two versions. So I think, you know, it was really important that there were musical motifs that kind of signaled his presence when he's not physically present. And, you know, I kind of struck upon this idea of just trying to create this spiral motif. So we had like the 60 string players do this spiral thing. And, you know, the whole idea about it was supposed to sound hypnotic, but also, you know, queasy and disturbing. And, you know, as the film progresses and, you know, the story gets darker and darker, that spiral motif kind of reoccurs more, and it becomes more, because we did different takes of the spiral as well, you know, like we sort of got to a point where we were like, just play it as disgusting as you can, you know, and so it's constantly kind of ramping up, and it's all to do with, like he isn't really present physically for a lot of the film, but he's constantly kind of infecting what is happening. And, you know, I think it's probably most clear in the scene where Hutter and Ellen have a big emotional showdown. And, you know, the way that scene starts and the way the music starts, it's almost like sentimental. And then as soon as you hear that spiral, it's just sort of like, okay. And also paired with like what Lily's doing at that time, you know, you just know there's a shift, even if you can't quite perceive why or what that is. So, yeah.
And obviously, you know, and that spiral is you know, sometimes it's really present in the mix, and sometimes like it is very low, and it's just sort of like a subconscious thing, you know.
It's almost like Jaws a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, there was one track that I was working on, and it was really hard to crack. Right.
There's a big castle montage sequence that like climaxes with Orlok attacking Hutter.
Yeah. It was a really hard track to crack just because it's a super important scene, but there's also a lot going on. And I think we were in a pre-mix or something. I can't remember, but I was just like, I don't know what to do. So I kind of just went off to a back room, and I just suddenly was like thinking about Jaws, because I knew like basically I needed to do something, but I knew it needed to be simple but effective. And the Jaws theme is probably like one of the most like economic but most effective themes you've ever heard. And not saying that what I ended up writing sounded like Jaws, but it definitely triggered something, and I was like, okay, all right, I think I know what we can do now, and it worked. You know, it just it just needed something.
I think one of Robin's like worst nightmares that was a reoccurring nightmare is when I would get a demo and we had a temp mix coming up, and so Neil Stemp, the music editor, and I would like slam some more shit on there to like make it fuller in ways that he was just like, what are you doing? And so sometimes in the temp mix, he's, you know, Robin's like running into the back room to like quickly compose something that is not as stupid as like what we like smashed in there to like try to get the vibe I was after.
They did it on purpose.
I was at the Academy Governors Awards event, Red Carpet, and we asked Lily Rose-Depp about making this film, and she said she was legitimately scared on the set when shooting. And I'm just curious, a good friend of mine, Peter Billingsley, who's known as Ralphie on A Christmas Story, he told me a story about how Bob Clark, the director of that film, kept the bullies, the bad guys, away from the kids when they weren't shooting to kind of keep that realism of being scared of them. And obviously they were much younger and that may have been more effective. But I'm wondering, Robert, on set, is there anything you do to set the tone, to keep it creepy? Do you keep the bad guys away from the good guys? Is there music played on set? Anything that you do to sort of keep that vibe?
Yeah, I mean, Bill being like a contemporary, like age-wise of most of the central cast, I kind of asked him when he was in makeup to like keep his distance a bit. On the weekends, he was allowed to have fun because I like on it, he was not allowed to see anybody, and I think that like Pennywise was something that he enjoyed overall, but didn't like the loneliness of it. But this was the first time I played a ton of music on set because my other films, like if you're shooting on the side of a mountain or like on the edge of a cliff, you don't need to bring in anything to help people imagine where they are. But this was mostly on a sound stage. So I played the Robin's demo music for Nosferatu. Damien Volpe, the sound designer, created some stuff that I played in the castle, and also that Spotify playlist that Robin and I we actually had several playlists. We had like a general one, we had like a nice sounding one, we had like a really fucked up one, we had characters. Character ones, we had Transylvania ones, like whatever. But I would play that stuff on set.
One thing that I'm always reminded of that we've interviewed Hans Zimmer in the past about his work with some different directors. He's mentioned that one of the early tricks that he has, I don't know how much of a trick it is he will meet with the director before they shoot something and then after they shoot, and he'll compare notes. He'll have lunch, whatever it is, but he'll compare notes. And he says a lot of times Ron Howard might come back and he's just been through the hell of shooting something and he's forgotten something that was really important earlier on when he was more involved at a script level. And I'm wondering whether you guys have anything like that, or if you remind each other of, hey, this particular theme or this particular emotional thing, that was something that was really, part of the script. Do you still want to emphasize this in the film itself? Do you have discussions like that, or something when you come back, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think
eyes.
I don't think it's that like intentional, like with Zimmer's approach, which is cool. But I think because we've been talking about this stuff for so many years, like it does. You'll be like, oh yeah, like remember we did say we wanted to.
Yeah,
that definitely happens.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we do, but I think the thing as well is, again, because Rob and I are like good friends. I mean, we talk all the time.
Yeah.
Often just about rubbish that has nothing to do with work. So, Rob and I are constantly we're just always talking to each other, aren't we? So I guess, yeah, I'm sure we do that, but we don't need, it's not like we're kind of like, I'll see you in 3 months and we can, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
for sure. Yeah.
There's always like conversation.
There's a lot of texting about whatever shitty horror movie we're watching that night.
Yeah, which is often.
Can I ask, is there a particular scene or maybe a couple scenes that were the biggest where you felt like it was the most crucial to just nail, that you spent a disproportionate amount of time on to get musically, to dial it in, to get exactly where the scene needs to be? What were those for Nosferatu?
Castle, like approaching the castle.
Mm-hmm.
What were you going to say?
I mean, the end.
Yeah, I mean, the end. Yeah, I mean, like the last sort of 8 minutes. That was obviously like a huge scene. And I remember when Rob explained how he wanted the music for that, it was very intimidating because I knew he would want it as one long continuous piece, and there's a lot going on. But the funny thing about that one was I think because I was so excited to score that scene, and I'd been thinking about it for so long. When I came to write it, which was quite early on in the process, it just flowed. Like it didn't take that long, which isn't me sort of trying to sound arrogant or anything, but I don't know. It was like a track that just really flowed, and I think I kind of wrote it within like a day and a half or 2 days, and it didn't really change much. So
well, there was Chris Columbus, like, was basically the first go was like, I don't know if it's quite enough for the climax of the movie, and then Robin did a polish based on that note, and then I don't think it did change much after that.
Yeah, I remember the note. Basically, like Chris said something like, "It's beautiful but boring." Basically, what he was talking about was the scene with the vampire hunters, as they're running through the town. And the thing is, he was right. I mean, I actually said to Chris at one of the screenings or whatever, like I said, like, thank you for that note, because he was totally right. It was very nice music, but it did need energy there. And, I mean, I can't really imagine that cue now without that part of the music. So yeah, but yeah, I'd say like approaching the castle, that was probably I think it's called A Carriage Awaits. That was probably the track that was hardest, but I think it was also because I think sound design, like
it was very hard to mix because I think in the Northman there are sometimes like walls of sound that, like, I think if you watch the movie in Atmos, like, there is enough separation because of what Atmos gives you, but I think any other format, like, it becomes kind of a wall of sound in a way that I'm not super proud of, and it's all me. But I really didn't want that this time. So we had a lot of spotting sessions where with Damien and Damien, the sound designer, and Robin, just saying, like, this is your turn, you do this and you'll shift here, but in the mix it is more complicated than that, and then all of a sudden the drum beats and the hoof beats, like, don't fucking, like, link up, and the horses are moving on screen, so, like, there's only so far you can go before it starts to look demented, but it easily sounds bad. So that it was very and it was definitely a sequence where, like, I wanted to hear a lot of things, but I also, like, really didn't want to have this wall of sound. So that was like those were some heated mix sessions to, like, to get that right. But it was cool.
But it's also because, I mean, like, that scene is, like, it's such an iconic scene. I mean, in other Nosferatus and, like, Dracula's, that approach to the castle is iconic. So it's obviously a super, super important scene for Rob. It has to be right. And the thing as well is, like, at that point in the film, that is when we start to kind of leave the real world behind. So, the way the sound design works and the way the music works, it kind of has to all walk this slightly odd tightrope where it needs to sound sort of real, but also kind of, like, fantastical and, like, magical and ethereal, and, trying to get the balance correct was hard. But I think we got there in the end. But yeah, that was a tough one, but it's a super, super important scene. So,
Yeah. And Robin, you mentioned earlier, you said, I think you were thinking about some parts of this for 18 months or maybe even longer than that. But I'm curious about the logistics. What kind of timelines are you dealing with for this? There's an immense amount of music. There's a lot of work that's going into this. So what how was that broken up, and what was your timeline?
I mean, I think, like, Rob has been talking to me about Nosferatu for a long time. So, I went into the project having a pretty good idea as to, what he wanted and why he was also doing the project. So I just had a lot of time to sort of sit with the script and think about the music. And I never like to go into writing sessions with, like, I don't like to basically start the process and be like, okay, cool, so where do I start? So I always try and go in with a lot of like very, very raw material, you know, whether that's just like a bunch of like hums on a dictaphone, you know, or like some notes that I've written. But yeah, I think, you know, again, like Rob and I have already said it, but we kind of build up these huge playlists of music together, and we're constantly kind of talking about films we like, films we don't like, music. You know, I think because we're constantly kind of talking about things that we're absorbing, it kind of just all helps. So when I come to write, I just have a really clear idea in general. And also, you know, like when Rob starts post, I start. So we have a different process, because I know like a lot of composers, directors, they'll wait like however many months until there's pretty much an edit. And then the musician comes in and just puts stuff on top. Whereas like it's kind of, I mean, you kind of see it as like a dialogue or something.
Yeah. So, I mean, like Robin, for the director's cut, which is, you know, should be called like the first cut, you know, Robin did like all the music for Reel 1, and then like, you know, a handful of like very important cues throughout. And then you know, and then I have been doing temp stuff with the with the music editor Neil. That is like 90% from the playlist, and if it's not from the playlist, it's shit that sounds like it was from the playlist. But then Neil is able to like, you know, grab like stems. I'm sure this is like every movie, but Neil can grab stems from the different pieces that Robin's composed, so that even the director's cut, which is like only a third Robin's music, still has the thread of Robin's music all the way through it, because he, you know, and that's one of the nice things about aleatoric music, is that like, yes, it's better like to go with it fresh and clean, but you can just pile a bunch of shit on top of each other to like make it through these like rough cuts, these, you know, these preview screenings.
Yeah, and also, I mean, Rob kind of has to do it that way because, you know, I think again, like as soon as Rob starts to kind of piece the movie together with Lou, he kind of just wants to hear like original music over everything. But obviously I can only sort of write so much in like 2 weeks. And, you know, like Rob also wants a lot of music in his films nowadays. You know, like Nosferatu there's a lot of music, and a lot of it has to be quite big. So it's, yeah, we start very early. It's a long process, you know, which has got like pros and cons. I'd say mostly pros, but it's a very long process. And it's, I mean, as soon as Rob starts post, I don't really finish until he sort of finishes to a certain degree. You know,
it's like 42 cues on the soundtrack or something like that.
51.
51. Oh, I think I confused it with the Northman.
Yeah.
Yeah. 51. That's a load, man.
Yeah, and we cut some as well from the soundtrack because it was just like, this is ridiculous. Like, I don't even want to listen to this. So
you got to be able to fit it on the vinyl these days too. It feels like that's the thing. Which, by the way, the vinyl looks amazing.
But we did get them to do a double, but I think asking them to do a triple would have been a bit too much. And also, the guy who runs the label is a friend of ours, so we don't want to bankrupt him. The triple vinyl cost. So yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because I've seen teasers for this film as far back as like last Halloween. But you chose, I don't know if you chose this or if it just fell this way, but the film, a very dark film, releases on Christmas Day. I did see one Christmas tree in the film. So is that the tie-in? What made you go that route, or were you involved in that decision, Robert?
Also, is this a Christmas movie? Let's get that going now.
Yeah, it's definitely a Christmas movie. There's a Christmas tree. They play O Tannenbaum on a music box at some point, and they say Christmas like 3 times. So it's definitely a Christmas movie.
It's official. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, you know, obviously there's a tradition of like, you know, interesting adult movies like coming out on Christmas, and it's also like kind of cool counter programming for a horror movie. So I'm excited by it, but I think the movie has a bit of a Christmassy, cozy vibe in its way.
It's winter viewing.
Yeah.
And also one of the things Rob and I bonded over was like, in Britain, there's like a tradition of like ghost stories. You know, it kind of started in Victorian times, and here it's kind of
Ghost
like,
stories for Christmas.
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
it's kind of like a bit of an institution here, and that's something that Rob and I both love. So I think when you found out it was going to be released at Christmas, I was like, yes, M.R. James.
It feels a bit a Christmas Carol-ish to start too. It's like Nicholas Hoult almost is like Bob Cratchit. He goes into the office and they're sending him on a mission, and he got to work on while everyone else is at home. I don't know. I got that vibe kind of to start off.
There's definitely, I mean, it's the same period, so it's Dickensian in its way.
Well, you guys, the film is amazing. For those watching or listening, if you haven't seen it, go check it out and listen to the score as well. Robin, incredible work. We're really grateful that you both joined us. It's really cool to have a discussion with both the composer and the director at the same time. We don't do that a lot. So we really appreciate your time on this, guys. And congratulations on this amazing film.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Are you guys, just because we're, are you working on a next project already? Or are you taking a little break until we get through the crazy awards campaign season ahead?
I can't, like, I couldn't be in prep with something because it's too chaotic, but I'm always working on the next thing, which is usually several things, because you have to have a lot of thoughts on the stove because you don't know what the studio is hungry for or what the studio finds disgusting.
Well, we're definitely looking forward to it. Your films are all masterpieces, and it's really great to chat with you guys. And thank you so much again for coming on the show, and best of luck in all the awards campaigning stuff.
Thank you.
For more, including bonus footage from Inside Composer Studios, follow Score, the podcast, on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and X.
Hey, wait! Before you go, this season of Score the Podcast is presented by Vienna Symphonic Library, used by many of the composers featured right here on Score the Podcast.
If you're looking for high-quality, sample-based virtual instruments that elevate your craft as a composer or musician, or just unlock the creative potential of your music, Vienna Symphonic Library has the tools that you need all in one place with the Synchron Series.
Recorded on Stage A of the Vienna Synchron Stage, the Synchron Series features every orchestral instrument, pianos, choir, everything you need, while innovating to create an intuitive, fully customizable software suite that puts you in control of everything you create.
These are real instruments recorded and engineered by the same people recording scores of your favorite films and TV shows. Netflix's The Crown, Disney and Marvel shows, Amazon Prime's Rings of Power, and HBO's Dune Prophecy, among many more. And the strings are something really impressive. Synchron Duality Strings is a package where you get both the large ensemble on Stage A and the small ensemble in a smaller, drier Stage B, performing simultaneously, so you can blend to create your own unique sound. Our listeners are using it, our guests on the show are using it. The best of Vienna, the city of music at your fingertips.
The city of music.
The city of music.
We need to get out there. Take a listen right after this message. We're going to play you a mocked up demo cue of Danny Elfman's Batman. You know what's my favorite? All using Vienna Symphonic Library software packages. It's unbelievable.
Or you can check them out yourself at vsl.co.at. Check out their sample player, free libraries, and demos that you can play around with right now.
And from all of us, thank you to the awesome team at Vienna Symphonic Library for supporting this season of Score the Podcast.